Hello again. I'm here for you this time with a video about kind of the historical context that our stories take place in. So, as you might have noticed, all the stories we're reading are kind of around the early 1900s. I think Olive Schreiner is more like 1890. I think The Stranger is like 1921, maybe. And Joyce stuff is kind of in the middle. It's somewhere between like 1905 and 1910. So we're at this kind of 20, 30 year period, like 1890 to 1920. This is not a time period that we focus on a lot or that we probably know a lot of things about. I think we know a lot more about like World War II and the 50s and the 40s and stuff. So the major event during this time period is World War One, much less discussed than the Second War. So I just wanted to give some context for like World War One as this kind of like major historical event of this time period. And even if some of the stuff was written before World War One, like technically started, the kind of buildup was already in motion. Like the forces that brought World War One about are things that were going on, for decades before that. Um, so I want to talk a little bit about what World War One like meant to the culture at that time, and maybe some possible ways that we see this showing up in some of our stories. Okay, so World War One is generally thought about as being like 1914 to 1918. Although you'll see like some different dates, and the U.S. doesn't get involved till later. But a lot of our writers, actually none of our writers are from the U.S. Joyce is Irish. All his stories are in Dublin, like we've talked about. I think Mansfield is English, and I think Schreiner is like South African, or Mansfield might be from like New Zealand or something. I forget. But none of them are actually from America, so they are kind of maybe on that earlier track of like 1914 as being the important start date. Okay, so World War One was just kind of like this like earth-shattering historical event. It was, at the time it was called the Great War. And it was something on a scale that no one had ever seen, especially for Europe, where there had been big wars, right? There was, the Napoleonic Wars are like 100 years prior to this in the early 1800s. But the way that technology had advanced and the number of soldiers that armies now consisted of, World War One was like a mass death event on a scale that was never seen at the time. And another big factor of this is that it was intensely brutal in a way that earlier wars weren't. Like the wars that Napoleon fought, they were still using, like muskets. It was still like similar to the American Revolution. They were using cannons and muskets and all that. But World War One is the first time that we see a lot of these more, devastating and brutal technologies of war introduced. For instance, it's the first war where we get machine guns, which just think about what a big change that is, just from like having, the guy standing up with the musket and he's got stuff the thing in and the big pluff of smoke, compared to a machine gun just going automatically, just mowing people down, right? It's totally different. And it's much more just like like savage in a way. Also, chlorine gas, the use of poison gases was a new thing. And if you've ever seen like any video of this, or even reenactments, or like things in movies or whatever, dying by chlorine gas was especially gruesome. It would, like, they describe it as it would set people's lungs on fire, and they would just kind of like scream silently as they're not even able to breathe, and it is awful. And people, they would turn their faces these terrible colors. This is where World War One is. We have images of all these people wearing gas masks, but it was like always a thing of like, can you get your gas mask on in time? Um, so yeah, chlorine, and as we know, chlorine just kills like literally every living thing, right? So breathing in just a cloud of chlorine, just awful, brutal stuff. Also submarines, right, which can take people by surprise and make massacre, whatever, hundreds of troops and things. Also planes. This is the first time that planes are really used in a large scale engagement in terms of dropping bombs and all this kind of stuff. So this really was like it was like technology was advancing at such a time, like at the beginning of the 20th century, that this really kind of thrust everyone into like a modern war without them really being prepared for it, you know? Like people still had this mentality of war as like this like glorious thing, you know, and it was all these like bright colors on their little flags, you know, like how it was like in the medieval with the knights and stuff, where um, you know, war was something that like rich people would go and be generals and things, right? Because it was all about the glory and the stature and pride in the country and these things. So people still kind of had these ideas coming into World War One, and like you put that in the face of a machine gun, and it's you know you can't continue to think of war like that. It was really kind of a shattering moment where we now looked at war as bad. That's kind of because of how World War One was and the kind of huge amount of death that these new technologies could bring about. Also, was famous for trench warfare, right? Which I think trench warfare speaks to like the pointlessness of it, right? World War II, we can like justify, right? It's like, okay, well, you know, the Nazis very bad, right? We need to stop the Nazis, so we had to fight that war, you know. And it's kind of an easy to draw the lines between like good and bad, you know, where you know the Nazis were bad, had to stop them, and most people say, well, yes, that's right. So that was not as controversial. World War One, like why was World War One fought? It's very complicated, but there's no easy like morality of the good guys versus the bad guys. You know, you might have heard that it was about like nationalism and alliances, and it's just incredibly stupid. Really, there was the murder of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, of course, but I feel like sometimes we think that's like the thing that made the war happen when it was kind of just like a match onto a you know all the kindling had already been set, so like that wasn't the only reason the war happened, right? Um, but it's kind of intensely meaningless and pointless, this war. And I think trench warfare symbolizes this because trench warfare is just, you know, the two sides in their trenches with the no man's land, right, where nobody is in the middle. They have their trenches, so they're below, right, so they can't get shot, and they have their machine guns all posted up so that if you try to go over the top, as they would say, you would just get leveled by the machine guns. And so it was just them sitting in the trenches, people just getting sick from you know diseases and terrible conditions. Trench foot, famously, of being in the wet, muddy trenches and like just getting infections and things, and just getting bombed, right? Just like waiting for bombs to fall on you. So it was, yeah, intensely pointless and also intensely brutal and vicious, right? Um, I want to read a little bit. I'll post this a few pages from this reading here, but I just want to read this. It has some of the numbers. Okay, it says here, in terms of the trauma of the war itself, the effect on modern consciousness cannot be overstated. It resulted in the invention of new weapons, such as submarines, airplanes, poison gas, and cannons with ranges over 75 miles, and produced more than 33 million military casualties and an additional 5 million civilian deaths, not counting the millions of war-related influenza deaths. With devastation on such a scale, it became absurd to celebrate noble ideas like human dignity in art, or blithely to assert a belief in human progress. The war produced a deep distrust of optimistic secular or teleological understandings of history, and seemed a climactic severing event that showed conclusively the failures of 19th century rationalism. So there's some big words in there that we don't need to worry about, but like one, I would want you to get the statistics from that, right? Was they say at least 38 million people, not counting people who died from illness. So like, you know, there weren't that many people in the world even back then. So to lose whatever 50 million or something, probably more than that, is yeah absurd. It was, you know, this is a time where you had generations where countries where you had a whole generation, you know, of men and men being soldiers mostly, who were just wiped out, right? Um, so yeah, and the other thing that they mentioned here is that it made it hard to think about history as being kind of progress. So this is the next point I want to get into. Before this, before like the 20th century and World War One, people had this view of history where like things are always getting better, right? If it was like a chart and it started, you know, back in the days of like cave people, you know, things just slowly and maybe unsteadily, but ultimately things are always getting better, right? Um, we started out living in caves, uh, and then we you know figured out fire and invented the wheel, and then we had kings and stuff, and we used horses and farming and all that. And then eventually we moved, we invented air conditioning and cars, and that's where we are now. So like this was the idea, just that history always gets better, that it's a narrative of progress, right? So World War I is a problem for this kind of thinking because it's like, well, how do you account for this pointless destruction on such a huge scale on this narrative where things are always getting better? Like for kind of the culture of European and America for like their like imagination, World War I was like the worst thing that ever happened, basically, right? At least on that level. So it's like if things get better over time, how is it that we could have progressed to a point where we now have the worst event in like human history? And you can't answer that, right? So the only way to think about it is then, well, it must not be true that things actually do always get better over time. And I think if we skip ahead to like the nuclear bomb for like World War II, it's like, well, how can we believe that humans and society always gets better when now we've created a weapon that can destroy the whole planet, right? So it complicates this idea of thinking about history as always getting better as like a narrative of progress. It made it impossible really for people to think like that for a large number of people at the same time, kind of all like snapped into this with the culture. So what this resulted in is a kind of loss of faith in a few different ways. Number one, I think, is in terms of technology, because just like people thought about history as always getting better, we thought about technology as just always getting better. Went from the wheel to the car to the air conditioning, like that. It was just something that helps us, medicines and things. That technology is something that would help humans, and that would be a benefit, and that would always get better. It's like, how do you account for chlorine gas in that story? Right? That we've now progressed to a level where we can kill each other in the most brutal and painful and awful ways, more so than just shooting someone with an arrow or, whatever people used to do. So technology is one of these things, as implied by like calling it loss of faith. Religion, the early 20th century is one of the first times where you see like a large number of people become atheists and kind of reject God because they would look at World War I and say, well, this if there was a God, like this couldn't have happened, right? That was what people thought at the time. So this is the first time where you see people kind of rejecting religion and being like, this is pointless, like there's no like good reason you could come up with for mass death like this. So earlier in history, being an atheist was not allowed. It would get people killed and stuff, right? So this is the first time you really see people start to reject any kind of religion. And then, like I said, you lose faith in that conception of history as always getting better and being a good thing. So it was really just kind of like this consciousness, like altering moment where none of the stories that people told themselves about where our society came from or where it's going or why it's good. None of these things kind of held up in the face of the mass brutality of World War I. So this is kind of the backdrop, right? So I think we can see this, for instance. I think we talked about like how in Araby, it's kind of a story of disappointment, right? It's a story of building up expectations and then deflating them and coming back to reality and ultimately like having to deal with that disappointment and maybe we can say it's a good thing because maybe that's the truth at least, right? Maybe that's more realistic. We're not living in a fantasy world anymore, so maybe it's a good thing. Um, but yeah, so like the kind of like loss of faith that that boy goes through in Araby in terms of believing in the idea of love that he had or in the girl or in the bazaar, the way he builds up the bazaar is supposed to be this amazing thing and then gets disappointed. I think that kind of reflects like the larger sentiment of the culture in the kind of face of World War I. And I think we can see this in Evelyn, the same way she builds up Buenos Aires. To be something fantastical and amazing, and then she's confronted with the reality of like the boat on this harbor, and it's just not what it was supposed to be, and then you have to kind of like deal with that loss of faith, and that's kind of where the whole culture was trying to deal with like this loss of faith in the things that they had believed before. One other big historical event that's going on in this time period is kind of the women's rights movement and the suffrage movement. So women get the right to vote in America in 1920. I think England's weird with this. I think they are a little bit earlier, maybe 1918 or something like that. but then it was only for a certain age, and then it, like later it became like all women or the same ages as men. You know, you can look into the history of like when people got certain rights, but like, you know, the women in the stories that we're reading, like, was it even legal for women to get divorces in these countries? Or even if it was legal, was it like possible economically? Like, would they you know, taken care of in any way if they did want a divorce? Or like, would they be able to get a job on their own to support themselves if they didn't want to be dependent on a husband anymore? So you can look to at a lot of these like women's movement historical stuff for this time period. And I think there's probably some connections there with our stories as well, in terms of like the ways that they're trying to think about like how sexism shows up in society and ways to resist it and things like that. So yeah, just a little bit of historical context for us there. And this, of course, goes along with the other topic that I gave you on the assignment sheet, which is you could make some kind of argument where you connect these historical events, either like the disappointment that everyone was going through with World War I to the stories, or maybe some of the specific stuff about like the women's rights movement at the time, and connect that to what's going on in our stories. And that could be some research that you do. Okay, talk to you soon.